Lucy from Charm About You, and I'm going to be showing you how to make a laptop case using the bow tie blocks. I'm also going to be showing you how to make some faux piping binding, how to finish off the case with buttons, and how to size it for your device. So let's get cracking. As you can see, I've already made up my bow tie blocks. I've made 16 total for the laptop case, and I've created 2 different panels that are going to form the case. Now, for my bow tie blocks, I've fussy cut these little kerchief girls and found some coordinating coloured fabrics to make up the bow ties. Of course, you can do whatever fabric combination you like and however many blocks you want to create for your case. I'm going to show you in the tutorial how you can adjust the pattern to whatever size laptop or device you're wanting to make a case for. So I've already gone ahead and done the preparation, making up the 2 panels. So I have the front panel piece here, and then I have the main panel that's going to make up the back and the main body of the case. So you can see I've just used some plainer fabric, a metallic linen for the back part. And then you may have noticed that the top row of the bow tie blocks is reversed, and that's because that top section is going to become the flap of the case. So I wanted to have that so that when it's flipped over, it will be facing the right way. Of course, you can make up this panel completely of blocks if you wanted to, or you could have a larger block be a feature on the back. However you decide to make it up, it's completely up to you. And really any combination will work nicely. I'm going to give you the dimensions of the panels that I've created. So this main section, mine is 16 by 16 inches. And I've got the lining piece cut to the same dimensions. So I've got the lining and the main panel. I've obviously got the patchwork top, and then I've just fused mine to some fusible web and I've quilted it. You could, if you want to, use ordinary wadding, but if you do that, you do need to place something underneath, just a muslin or something like that, to protect your sewing machine. I find with the fusible fleece, because it's nice and bonded, it doesn't create a lot of lint in the machine, so you can just go ahead and quilt it as is, but you're not quilting it to the lining. So I've got my main panel, my lining, and then I've got my front panel, and that one is 16 across by 8.5. And I've got the lining piece for that panel, which is slightly larger, cut at 16 by 10.5, and I'll come to why in a moment. So I'll just show you how the case is going to end up so that you've got an idea. You're working with your panel, then you would have your lining, and then you're going to have the front section there. And so this section is going to become the flap of the case. So you can see now why I've made those blocks the other way up, so that as the case will be completed, that's going to be facing the right direction. And then if I turn it around to the back, you can see I've just got a row of the bow tie blocks there and the main panel. So I'm going to come on to how to construct it. And obviously, if your laptop case is, if your laptop is larger, you're going to need to make your panels bigger. It's better to make them larger and then cut them down, rather than trying to make it the exact size and ending up with something that's too small. So I've just quilted this with basic straight lines. You don't have to do quilting if you don't want to, but it does just add a little bit of stability as well to the case. So I've got my main front section here, and then I've got my lining piece of fabric, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to match it up along that top edge, and I'm just going to stitch 1/4 inch all the way along here. So I've stitched along the top edge there with a 1/4 inch seam, and now what I'm going to do is just give this a press and I'm going to press it from the front out like that. So I just want to make that nice and crisp and press that edge out. Okay, and then I'm going to fold it over to create, hopefully you can see that there, I've got a little bit of the fabric showing round the side. So rather than folding it like so, where the seam is, I'm actually folding it over the edge of the seam. So I'm leaving some of that fabric, some of that lining fabric showing on the top there, almost like a faux piping or binding edge. So having done that, you can just fold it over and give it a little finger press along that bottom edge. And then what I'm going to do is just stitch across the top to hold that in place. And you can see that's why I've made the lining fabric slightly bigger. If you wanted to make that even bigger, you could sew with a 1/2 inch seam or something like that to create a bigger edge, and then you can just trim that bottom section off once you've finished. So all I'm going to do now is just top stitch across that top edge. Okay, so you can see that I've got the walking foot set up on my machine. This just helps because obviously we're going through quite a few layers. I'm going to move the position of the needle because I want the fabric as much as possible to be underneath the foot. So I have the option on my machine to move the needle over to the side. That's just going to give me a nice neat top stitch there. You could, if you wanted, stitch in the ditch along this faux binding piped edge, but I quite like the look of having it actually on the edge itself. So having just positioned that, let me move my thread out of the way and I can just begin to top stitch. I like to give a slightly longer length when I'm doing top stitching, so I've set my machine to 2.8. And because you could pin this or clip this edge if you wanted to, as I haven't, I'm just readjusting it as needed to keep that edge nice and straight. So there we have it. You can see the top stitching there along that top edge and just gives a nice finish to that panel. Okay, so now we've got that front panel completed. I just need to trim off that bottom edge so that everything lines up nicely. And now we can start to fit the case together. So I'm going to take the lining, the main panel lining, and place the pocket over the top. And at this point, you want to grab your device because we're going to check to see what the fit is going to be like. So I'm making this for my laptop. So I'm going to pop it between the lining and the panel, and I'm going to leave myself a little bit of space at the bottom there. My laptop's actually quite thick, so there is going to be a need to leave a bit of fabric, you know, to make the seam at the bottom there. But what I'm looking at now is the width. So you can see if I fold it round the edge there, I'm going to have to trim some off at the sides. And what I want is, I don't want to make it so tight that it's going to be hard to fit the case in. I want to give myself a bit of wiggle room. So I'm actually going to cut 1/4 inch away from the sides of where the centres of those, the point of the diamond is, of the centre of the bow tie block. I'm going to do it about 1/4 inch away. And you can see then if my seam is there, I've just got a little bit of wiggle room either side of the case. Obviously I want it to be cosy in there, but if you're going to have trouble getting it in and out, that's just going to become frustrating. So having done that, I'm going to trim down the front panel. I'm going to just do it at the same time as the lining. And I'm going to get my ruler and I'm going to line it up just over 1/4 inch away from the point at the edge of the bow tie block. Now depending on your case or your laptop or your device, this can differ. You just need to measure where the edges of your device are and give yourself a little bit of wiggle room. And obviously you've got to account for the seam. So the seam is going to be 1/4 inch. That's why if I make this just over 1/4 inch, that should be enough when I come to sew it together, that I'm going to be able to easily fit my laptop inside of there. So I'm just going to trim that side. And there is a bit of waste here, but it's minimal. Okay, and I'm going to do the same on this side. So that's my panel and my lining fabric ready to go. Obviously I've got to trim my main section, and you'll notice because I quilted this, I just said the fusible fleece was a little bit larger. I'm not too worried about it. As I know this is the same size, I'm just going to do the same thing and go 1/4 inch away from the edges of those blocks. And it helps that I've quilted. I can line up my quilting lines with the lines on the ruler to make sure that everything is straight as well. Okay, while we're here, I'm just going to trim off the bottom so that that's nice and neat. Now, if you are unsure about the sizing of everything coming together, because I've trimmed that bottom panel, I'm just going to check now that my lining fabric is going to see, yeah, it's slightly larger. So I'm just going to trim my lining fabric back. And it's fine that you make these adjustments as you're going along. I think it's better that you're just checking, making sure that everything is as it should be. Obviously, even when you quilt the panels, depending how much quilting you do, they can come down in size as well. So just making sure that your linings are the same size and everything's nice and neat as you go along. So what I can do now is I can just double check again, that way, that everything is going to fit as I want it to. And yeah, that's looking really good. So once those seams are sewn up, that's going to be a nice fit. It's going to be snug, but not so tight that I'm not going to be able to get the laptop in. There's just a little bit of wiggle room there around my laptop. Now, you can just keep the flap as is. What I'm going to do is I'm going to round the corners just for a little bit of interest, because I can. So not something you have to do, but if you wanted to, you can. So I'm going to do my lining and my main panel at the same time, to make sure that they're in line with each other. So I have this nifty tool, which is the curved corner cutter by Creative Grids. I've been known to use plates, CDs, anything that has you know, a rounded edge in order to cut my fabric. But this is nice because you know it's going to be exactly the same. It's got 3 different corner radiuses you can use as well. So you can have a more sloping corner or a slightly tighter corner. I think I'm going to go... Yeah, I'm going to go with the 2-inch radius, so it's just giving it a nice gradual curved edge there. So I can just go ahead. This actually needs trimming a little bit. It's looking a little raggedy. It's not lined up, so just going to trim this edge down. There we go, that's better. I want to be working with as neat seams as possible, so that when you come to stitch it together you haven't got all those frayed sections. There we go, so that's just curving that corner edge. You need to trim a little bit off there as well. My lining's hanging over slightly. This is real life, folks. This is what happens. There we go. You can see how nice that corner edge looks there. So I'm just going to do the same on the other side. Trim down my lining to make sure it's straight. Do that first. Oops. And then use the 2-inch section on the corner cutter. So you just line it up with the straight edges and then go ahead and cut that curved edge off. Okay, so that's the curved edge of my laptop case. Now, I haven't talked about closure yet. Mine is going to have 2 buttons and I'm using elastic to close it. You could use Velcro. So if you're wanting to do Velcro, you could do sewing or stick on. Obviously you want to think about the placement. Put it there. I would put your device in the case and just, you know, make sure that it's going to be folded over onto your lining. So you would put some Velcro on the lining here and on the front panel there if you wanted to do that. You could do buttonholes if you're into that kind of thing. I'm just keeping it quite simple. I'm going to use elastic and I'm going to have 2 buttons on my front panel here. So I actually might pop my laptop back in to see the positioning of it. So I think my buttons are probably going to end up here. So I might as well line it up with the seams and put my elastics there so I can have the buttons. Or do I want it a bit further out? Decisions. Yeah, I think I want it a little bit further out. So I think I'll do it on this seam here. It's a bit too close there. These might end up flapping about. So I'll do it on these seams here. So we're going to start to put the whole thing together. I'm actually going to attach the elastics to the lining so that when they pull down to cover the buttons, it's sort of coming from the underneath rather than the front. And what I'm using for elastics is literal hair elastics. You can use pieces of elastic, but what I like about this is it's quite easy to sew them in because they stay together nicely. They've got good spring in them, and they're just simple. I tend to have a lot around because I have 2 girls. Well, one's got short hair. The long-haired girl wears hair bubbles. And they're cheap and cheerful. Elastic's quite a hard commodity at the moment as well, so it's quite nice to have this as an option. So I can line up there where the elastic's going to go. I can sew over it and just trim off that metal section as I come to it. So I'm just going to baste the elastic into place. Just as I'm saying that, going to double check if it's there. How far is it coming over? I might want to make it slightly shorter. It's a little bit of a guessing game. You've got to take your seam into account as well, because you're going to come in 1/4 of an inch, so you don't want your elastic ending up too small. But then if it's too big, the buttons are going to end up too far down. So it might just take a little bit of playing about with to determine where's going to be the right place for you to have the elastic. So I've just pinned the elastic up at the top. I've popped some pins in and it's just to the lining, not to the main part, just attaching it to the lining. So I'm just going to stitch across those to hold them in place, and then I can cut off that top part with the metal. It's these loops at the bottom here that are going to be going around my buttons. And obviously I'm sewing it inside the case so that once everything's turned out, you know, to the right side, that's where it's going to go. So you can see there, I've just basted the elastic in place. And you want to make sure that you're doing that within the seam allowance. So you don't want to be able to see those stitches once everything's put together. Okay, so lining fabric face down, and then your pocket panel over the top, lining up the bottom and the 2 edges. And then you're going to place the main panel right side down, wrong side up. Line up all of the edges, and you can either clip or pin. So you can either clip or pin these in place. I'm going to use clips because we have got quite a lot of layers, and I just find that they hold it nicely together and you're not having to jab yourself with pins. So just go along all the edges and pin or clip everything together. And we're going to be sewing this again with a 1/4 inch seam. I like to always put one where the top of the pocket is as well, so it's just like a little memo to myself that that's where that pocket is. And what we're going to do is we're going to leave a gap along the top edge. and I'm just going to do it in between the two elastics. So I'm going to leave a gap there and not, so I will start sewing here all the way around and end over here. Okay, so once you've got everything pinned or clipped together, you're going to sew all the way around the edge with a 1/4 inch seam, except you are going to leave an opening. Sorry, so not all the way around. You're going to start at one end, sew all the way around, and remembering to leave a gap. So I'm just going past where my elastics are, and I'm leaving a gap on the top edge here of the flap. So I'm sewing with a 1/4 inch seam. Again, I've got my walking foot on because we're going through quite a few layers. I'm just doing a normal stitch length 2.4. I'm going to do a reverse as I start. I'm going to show you how I go round these slight corners as well. So I'm going to slow my sewing machine down a little bit. And take that first clip off. Helps to put your foot down. And I can just do a little back stitch around, over the elastic as well, just to help secure it a little bit further. So I'm just going to do this quite slowly, and I'm using my stop start button, so I tend to keep my finger on the stop button so that I can adjust as needed. You may need to stop and pivot, which is absolutely fine. You just want to get neat seam along that corner edge. I'll speed up slightly. And then I'm coming up to where my top edge of my pocket is, because I had a clip there to remind me. So I'll just do a little back stitch there as well to just secure that front pocket where the laptop's going to go. As I come down to that bottom corner, I'm just going to stop and pivot. Didn't really slow down at the corner this time, but I can do as needed. again, just a little back stitch over that elastic, and then I'm just going to stop and do a little back stitch and making sure I'm leaving a gap. Okay, so I've sewn around the outer edge and I've left a gap up at the top. So I'm just going to trim off those bits of elastic that are sticking out, because those are secured now. And then I'm going to turn it through with the hole in the lining. I'm just going to push out the seams and the corners. You can use a little tool to help you do this. Turning through the pocket. Turning out the pocket, I should say, not through. Just turning out the pocket. You can get a little bamboo stick or a corner turner to help push out those corners. And then I just tend to use my fingers to roll the seam along the rounded corners. You can see how nicely, oh, little thread, that's turned out, and we haven't lost the points of our corner bow tie. Corner bow tie blocks. And again on that side, that's looking nice and neat. We haven't lost the points there either, so that's good. And just roll between my fingers to get the corner to come out. And then you'll need to fold in the edges of the top flap, and you can just stitch that with a whip stitch to hold it together. I've got my elastics there. I'll give this a good press to make sure the lining stays as it should, and maybe just poke out those corners slightly. So all that's left to do is stitch up that bottom seam and sew the buttons on. What I would recommend again is to place your device inside the case if you are putting buttons on. Pop it inside the case to make sure that the buttons, you know, that you're sewing the buttons exactly where you want it. So I think mine are going to be just above that central, that point there where those sections meet. So I will sew the buttons onto there, and then the elastics will hold those nicely in place. So I'm going to go ahead and give that a press, hand stitch that and sew the buttons on, and I'll show you a little bit of that if I can do. So I've given everything a good press, pressed the lining and the outside of the case. You can see I've already attached one of the buttons. I am using mismatched buttons that I dug out of my Nan's button tin. So it doesn't really bother me that they're mismatched. I quite like it. It just adds an individual touch. Obviously you can use matching buttons, or like I said, if you want to do a Velcro closure or buttonholes, you can. So I have just sewn that one on and ensured that it fits as it should. Everything is nice and snug. So I'm going to take my laptop out now and sew the other button on. I just want to mention, when it comes to buttons, obviously it's personal preference. You can use whichever kind you like, but I do like the ones that have a little fitting on the back rather than ones that are completely flat. So they sort of wobble about. It makes it easier to attach the elastic to them. They're readily available and they're very easy to sew on as well. So you've just got the nice coverings of the outer part of the button. You don't see any stitches. It's all hidden. When it comes to sewing the buttons on, I do like to try to be nice and secure. I'm sure many of you will know how to sew buttons far better than me, but for me the security of it is the most important thing. So I'm going to be careful. I'm not stitching through the back, just through the main part of the panel. And my buttons were just sitting nicely just above this corner section here. So I just do a couple of little stitches just to secure it. I can go right through to the lining. I'm just using a coordinating thread, and this thread is 40 over 3, so it's a nice strong cotton thread that's going to hold the buttons in place. So I do like to try to go through to the back, but if you're just catching that first part and the lining on occasion, it shouldn't matter too much. And then I can just go through the whole of the button, and I'm just going to repeat that like a million times. Not quite, but quite a few times to make sure that that's really going to be nice and secure, because obviously it may get some pushing and pulling on it from when I'm opening and closing the case. Now I don't know why, but I always do a few little wraparounds. It's just something my mum always told me to do when sewing on buttons. Probably not completely necessary on this type of button, but I just do help. Just think it does help secure the button in place. And I know from replacing buttons plenty of times on my kids' school uniform from the manufacturers that the ones I sew never come off. So that's just what I do. So I'll just repeat doing that. And then when I feel that that's really nice and secure, I'm going to come through to the lining to knot the back off. So you can hardly see the stitches there on the inside because it's a coordinating colour of thread, but no matter anyway, because no one's really going to see it. So I just like to come through the loop to secure and then pull it through again, and I will snip that off. And there we have the 2 buttons on our case. So I'm going to go ahead and show you now closing the opening. I did actually mistakenly say earlier whip stitch. You could whip stitch if you want to, but I'm going to do a ladder stitch to secure that opening in the top of the case. So I usually use some sort of neutral thread. Opening a new thread, neutral thread. I just happen to have this paler blue on hand, but a cream or lighter grey. Obviously it depends on whatever fabric you're using. Just want to make sure you've got something that coordinates, and I always like to use 50 weight thread when I'm doing a ladder stitch and closing up an opening. You can double it over if you want to, but it's not a seam that's going to get you know, a lot of pressure put on it, so I don't think it needs to be a particularly strong thread necessarily. You can see that I've just clipped, used clips to close off that seam. You could of course use pins, whatever is your preference, and I just did give that a little press with the iron when I pressed the whole case as well. So I'm just going to come in the opening up through the seam out to the edge, and then just start doing a ladder stitch all the way across. So just coming out one side, down underneath where I've come out, grab a little bit of the fabric and just continuing along all the way like that. Does help if you've given this a press, because you can see the edges quite clearly of where you need to be stitching. And providing you come onto the other side directly above or below, the stitches should remain invisible. So once you pull on it, you can't really see those stitches at all. The other option here would be to top stitch across the top with your sewing machine. I just tend to find, because it is a bit bulky with all the seams in there, it doesn't always look particularly neat, so I would prefer to just do it by hand. But of course, doing it on your machine is an option. I'd recommend, again, keeping the walking foot on, because you're going through all of those different layers. So as we get up to the end, just do a couple of little stitches. You can go back on yourself if you want to. I'm just going to knot and bury that knot in the seam. So just go back in where I came out of. Check I've not gone through that side. And just pull that knot through. You can clip that off. And there we are, our finished laptop case.